In this video, we will talk about directory permissions. Directory permissions use the same three sets of three permissions, read, write, and execute, for the user, the group, and everyone else. And they're stored in the same sort of structure, the mode. The question becomes, for directories, if it's using the same permission structure, what do those permissions mean? What does read mean for a directory? What does write mean for a directory? And what does execute mean for a directory? So I've created a directory here. I have a handful of subdirectories, and each of those has some different permissions about them that we'll talk about. Normal directory is there as sort of a, well, normal directory. Normally, if I own a directory and I give access, if you have access to a directory, you either have read, write, and execute, or just read and execute. So in the case of normal directory, I own it. I have read, write, and execute. Everyone else has read and execute. Basically, the difference is whether you want to give write permission to people. Write permission would allow them to make changes to the directory. And you may notice most of these directories are owned by root. Root is the system user, the user that owns everything in Linux. They all have group Jeff, and the reason I've set it up this way is so that the permissions that apply are not the permissions of the owner in most cases, except for a normal directory. They are the permissions of someone else, of the group. I've made the group and the others the same permissions. So those are the permissions that are going to apply as we talk through this. First, let's talk about normal directory. I have full permissions. That's going to be kind of our baseline. I have read, write, and execute on that directory. So what does that mean? Well, it means I can do ls. I can see what's in the directory. I can access something in the directory. It's just a text file that says this is a file in the normal directory. And I can create a file in that directory, and everything's there. We'll talk about that do not touch file in a little bit. So those are sort of the default permissions, being able to look at files in the directory, being able to access a file from a directory, and being able to make changes to the directory. Now let's take a look at the read execute directory. Now I only have read and execute permissions in that. I don't have write. So let's see what that does. I can do an ls. That's just fine. I can look at that file. Now, of course, the file permissions themselves are going to come into play on that. The directory permissions matter too. We'll talk about that in just a minute. I can do ls, I can access files, but can I create something? No, I get permission denied. That's because I need write permission in order to be able to create files, rename files, or delete files. Those are all changes to a directory. What happens if I only have read permission? I have this directory read only. I only have read permission on that directory. So if I do ls of read only, I get an error message that says permission denied, but then I see the file there. That's telling me that there is a file in that directory called file. So if I was able to see that there's a file, why did I get permission denied? This will be a little more clear if we do ls-l. ls-l on read only. We get the permission denied on read only/file. Then we see that there is a file there, but we get no information about that file. We know that it's a file. That first column's a hyphen. We don't know what the permissions are. We don't know who the owner is. We don't know who the group is. We don't know the size of the file, and we don't know the modification time of the file. We just get question marks for that. This is something you can't see, but the file called file in every one of these directories is identical. It looks like this one in normal directory. What really is the case is I have read permission on that file. I am allowed to look at that file, but I wasn't able to get any information about it. What's going on? That is because I did not have execute permission on the directory. And I can't cat the read-only file. I get permission denied. Again, if we look at the file permissions, if we could look at the file permissions, I would have read permission on that file. But I get permission denied when I try to access that file. And that is because execute permission on a directory is needed to access a file. Whatever the permissions on the file are, I have to have execute permission on the directory. In fact, I have to have execute permission on every directory in the path to the file. So you could almost consider it a mistake if you saw read-only permission on a directory. It's almost always read and execute, if it's anything at all. And finally, we'll prove it. I can't create a new file because I don't have write permission. The remaining directories all have some sort of quirk about them that will just highlight some features of directory permissions. In the normal case, you either have read and execute or you have read, write, and execute. And the difference is whether or not you're allowed to make changes to that file. Or the third alternative is you have no permission on a directory. Because read and execute kind of go together. We've looked at a read only. How about an execute only? If I do an ls on execute only, I get a permission denied on that directory. I don't have read permission, so I'm not allowed to see what's in that directory. But I said before, I have made a file called file in every directory. First of all, tab completion, I'm pushing tab here. Tab completion isn't working because I have to be able to read the directory to do that. But if I know the name of the file, and I have permission on the file, and I have execute on the directory, I can access that file. It's kind of an interesting little quirk. I may not be able to look in the directory and see what the files are called, but if I know they're there, I can get to them if I have execute. By now you should be able to guess what happens in read write only. I can do an ls, I can make changes to the directory. But you notice that this particular version of ls has highlighted that directory. It's really just saying, these are weird permissions. I don't know what you're doing here. I can create files, I can rename files, I can delete files, but I can't actually access anything in the directory. That's why it's considered weird. The final thing we want to talk about with directory permissions is a potentially confusing implication of all this. So let's go in the normal directory. We have some files here, and I have read permissions on file. I just created new file. I have read and write on it. But there's a file do not touch, and I do not have permissions on that file. I have no permissions whatsoever. If I try to cat it, I get permission denied. Obviously, if I wanted to make changes to it, I can't do that either because I don't have any permission on it. But I can delete it. Now I'm being asked a question. I'm being asked, do I want to remove the write protection? When we talked about RM, we mentioned there's a -I flag that will ask you about things. Normally, the default of RM is not to ask you, but it will ask in cases like this. I have permission to remove this file, even though I don't have any permission to the file itself. Why is that? RM is flagging this situation. It's saying something is a little bit off here. You are given permission to remove this file that you don't have any permission for. So do you really want to do it? Yes, of course I want to do it. That file is gone. So what's going on? If we look at the directory permissions, I have write permission to that directory. And that's the only permission I need in order to delete a file. I do not need to have any permission on the file itself. Once you understand that, you can delete a file that you don't have any permission for because it's the directory permissions that matter, not the file permissions. I think if you understand that little anomaly or paradox or whatever you want to call it, if you understand that situation, I think you'll have a really good understanding of directory permissions.